Good morning. Happy Monday. Welcome to another week of GPP3O, our leadership and peer support class. Today we are starting our week 2 of our 9-week radio Zoom schedule. Every Monday to Thursday from 11 until noon, you've got this GPP3O class airing. On Monday to Thursdays, we run all of our classes, leaving you Fridays to get caught up on any coursework you may have. This term, in addition to our leadership and peer support class that we've got, we run our usual PLAR, the junior PLAR. If you need the English, the history, geography, that will be this term. We also have the grade 11 English and the NBV3E course happening this radio term 2A. For those that are joining us and missed week 1, you have a chance to get caught up still. Don't feel pressured. We have made it through lessons 1 to 4. Today and tomorrow, we're going to go over lesson 5 together. It'll be a 2-day course material to get through it, and then we will be doing a review, so don't feel like you're falling behind. You can jump in and join us. To submit your work, you want to just hand in the key questions. The support questions are just to get you thinking, to get you discussing, but are not for grades. Remember, when you have completed a lesson, I ask that you send it in. Don't hang on to it. When you submit it after you've completed it, it gives you a chance to read the feedback and do better. There's always room for improvement on the next assignment. So please be submitting your work. You can scan and email it to our studentwork@nnec.on.ca. If you're in community, feel free to give it to your DEC. If that's easier, drop it at the Learning Center and they'll pass it on to us. Or if you're here in town, you can always submit work by coming in, or after hours, you can hand it in to the outdoor mailbox. One more reminder that you can also submit work directly online through our Google Classroom by finding the assignments listed in the coursework tab. By sending it in online, you complete it right there on Google Doc, gets sent to me, and I can mark it right away, giving you instantaneous feedback. A plug, as if you need extra motivation in case you do. Every term we do a student draw. Now, there are 2 draws that happen at the end of each term. The first is for lessons submitted. That means every time you complete an assignment and you hand it in, your name gets entered into our draw. Every assignment that you do, every lesson that you do, gets your name put into the draw. So the more work you submit, the more times your name gets entered, the better chance you have of your name being drawn at the end of term. When you have completed all 20 lessons and you finish the culminating activity, you pass everything successfully, you earn the credit. Your name then gets entered into that second draw for credits earned. When you have earned the credit, your name gets put in and a second draw is done. So you actually have the opportunity, you could win 2 prizes. That happens at the end of term. Like I said, we're only on week 2 of our 9-week. So that draw will most likely be happening April 17th. So stay tuned for the prizes. Get your work submitted for that extra bonus motivation there. Again, if you have any questions as we're going throughout the classes, as you're going through the IL material, if you ever need to reach me, my office hours are Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Keeping in mind that I do broadcast on air from 11 until 12. If you have any questions as we're going through our radio Zoom classes, you can always call our toll-free number, 1-800-667-3703, with any questions you might have. If you have questions afterwards, you can reach me straight at my desk, 807-737-1488, extension 2228. You can email me or connect with me on Facebook. All of these classes are being recorded, so you can watch them at your leisure whenever it's convenient for you, either on our YouTube channel or by visiting Google Classroom. Today, we are jumping into Lesson 5. This course has 4 units. Each unit has 5 lessons, giving us 20 lessons in total. Today and tomorrow, we're going to be going through the Lesson 5 material, which will bring us to the end of Unit 1. We'll do a review so that you can keep on top of all of the theories and concepts as we go. We don't want to just be learning for the test, so to speak. We want to be able to cement all of this learning so that we can carry it with us as we move into perhaps positions of leadership. We're going to be revisiting the ideas on Wednesday and going through each class. Some of these lessons, much like today's Lesson 5, can take more than one class. When that happens, you will notice on our Google Classroom and our WASA YouTube channel that this will be Lesson 5.1. This is the first half of the Lesson 5 material. Some of the learning that you get in your IL booklet is enough for what you need to do the key questions. But the beautiful thing about Radio Zoom is I get to give more detail, go in more depth about the concepts, teaching you some more background and other theories that can help aid in your leadership and peer support. So it's great to be able to tune in either live with us or watch the recordings on Google Classroom and our YouTube channel afterwards. If you haven't had a chance to check out our YouTube channel yet, you'll see that all of our courses that are going during Term 2A, I mentioned them earlier, they're all posted there with a description, so you know what it is that we're covering. That way, if you're struggling with one certain topic, you don't have to watch the entire playlist. You can say, it's Lesson 4, I'm not quite understanding temperaments, I didn't get what all of the theories were, so you can go back and watch just that class again without seeing all of the other things that you do understand. So there's a plug for our YouTube channel, watching the recordings, being confident in if you're just joining us now, you don't have to feel like you're behind. You can watch those and get caught up and join us. Today's class, Lesson 5.1, Part 1, is how to learn. How do you learn, and how does knowing this help you to teach others? Our learning goals for today's class are that I can identify the 4 main ways of learning. I can describe how learning affects behavior and thinking. I can then apply theories of learning to real-life situations. Our success criteria is that by the end you should be able to say I can identify and describe methods of learning and how they apply. That's our goal for today. Let's jump into the material. If you're following along in your IL booklet, we are Unit 1, Lesson 5, page 38. Learning, first of all, is defined as gaining a new piece of knowledge, a skill, or an attitude. We have narrowed it down to 4 primary methods of learning, and that's what we're going to cover in today's class. The first being teaching. You learn by being taught. The second is experience. The third is studying. And the fourth is accidental. We're going to jump into what each of these mean and try to think of areas in which we have learned things through teaching, experience, study, or accidental learning. The first is teaching. It's important to note that teaching, the method of learning, occurs in a setting where you've got a teacher and instructor who gives a lesson. This type of teaching, of learning through teaching, is purposeful. It's an organized method of bringing about learning by creating an atmosphere in which it can best take place. There's purpose to it. You've got an objective. There is a topic that needs to be shared and explained. You do it in an organized manner so that learning can happen more easily, which best takes place when you are in a positive environment or an atmosphere. Some of us really need that atmosphere, environment of learning more than others. We've already talked about temperaments and the way that we take things in. We talked about the multiple intelligences. We've done self-assessments to help us know ourselves a little bit better and what it is that we need. If we are a visual learner, we want those visual aids. We want the slides, we want the pictures, we want the anchor charts up on the wall. But it's important to note that if you are a visual learner, too much can be overwhelming. You don't want a crowded classroom filled with too many visual distractions. We need to find the balance of what works for us, and for many people, we all have our different methods, and so it affects others more greatly. Some people don't mind, other people get really distracted by it. So we want to pay attention to how it is that we're learning so we know what could work best for us. So the style of learning that involves teaching requires a teacher and a pupil, that's a student, directly and genuinely involved for best results. The second is experience. A person can also learn through experience, which is the gaining of knowledge or a skill by being exposed to it. Watching closely while a cook makes a meal or trying repeatedly to throw a football correctly are both examples of learning through experience. You can learn through observation, you can learn through doing by having activities that are hands-on. Many hands-on skills are best acquired through experience. You might really love football and you know all of the theory behind, you know the physics for throwing a football. If any of you have tried to learn a new skill and maybe you've watched a YouTube clip first on how to play guitar, you might have the theory, you might have the chords memorized, you might have even taught yourself to read sheet music, you might have watched footage, you might have watched the Super Bowl, going back to our football example. Sorry, I'm switching back and forth. But it's quite different when you actually have the football in your hands or you actually have the guitar in your hands. Realizing for some that putting theory into practice is a lot harder than just simply watching and learning. So some things are best by having the hands-on experience. Others can occur just by being exposed to it, just by seeing it, watching it. All of these types of learning are called experience. The third primary method of learning is studying. Learning may come about as a result of study, which is a decision by an individual to try to gain some new information through their own efforts. So studying occurs by gathering information. It's also purposeful. You're doing it through your own efforts to try and gain some new information. This can happen through reading, it can happen through watching, it can happen through performing. An example of this type of learning is a student going to a library, looking up a book to gain a specific piece of information. Now, it can also be a scientist performing an experiment. They want to gain new information through their own efforts. So, studying as a method of learning is a decision by an individual to try to gain some new information through their own efforts. The last is accidental learning. This type of learning occurs without any effort or trying. It's important to note that learning does not always take place on purpose. Knowing the words to your favorite song, even though you did not try to memorize them, or remembering the directions to your friend's house are just two examples of learning by experience that are accidental. Have you ever caught yourself subconsciously humming a tune and words of a catchy commercial? You learned it without trying or any effort, but just by repeatedly being exposed to it. So it's learned without trying, but happened through repeated exposure. These are our 4 primary methods of learning. Now, how do they help us? What does it mean for us to go into fields of leadership? What are the effects of learning? In your IL course material, you will see a diagram for our visual learners who like to break things down and see it in a clearly presented format. On page 39 of your material, you will see the diagram that learning can result in changes in the way a person thinks and acts. So on the right side here in your diagram, in your IL booklet, or if you're following along with our slides, you can see in the blue we have a new way of thinking and a new way of behaving. Learning changes in the way a person thinks and behaves. It can affect the way they remember, that they solve problems, that they come up with new ideas. Changes in behavior influence the way that other people's actions or events outside of yourself affect you and your response to them. So on the left-hand side of our diagram, we have the 4 primary methods of learning. We have through teaching, experience, study, and accidental learning. We use learning to gain a new knowledge, skill, or attitude. And once we have that knowledge, once we have that learning, it can branch off to give us new ways of thinking or new ways of behaving. In your IL booklet, it jumps to how learning affects thoughts, how it affects your thinking. Today's lesson is going to expand and touch more on how learning affects behavior. There was a Greek philosopher named Aristotle. Maybe you've heard of him. He proposed a theory on how people learn, and this was way back in 300 BC. He noted that people best remember things that happen together, things that are similar or in contrast or paired. He called this association. He found that when people best remember things that happen together, or when they are similar, or when they are in contrast, or when they're paired together, it's through association. So he called his theory of association. For example, the descriptions of 2 similar objects or events are easier to memorize when their similarities are pointed out. Thunder and lightning are paired into a logical consequence of one another. Romeo and Juliet are forever paired in our minds as a timeless romantic couple, even though we may not have read the play or seen the movie. Black and white, tall and short contrast with each other, and this association makes them easier to remember. So we have things that happen together like thunder and lightning. We have things that are similar. We have things that are in contrast, as well as paired. The descriptions of 2 similar objects or events are easier to memorize when their similarities are pointed out. This is all Aristotle's theory of learning called association. From Aristotle grew wonderful psychologists and sociologists who came up with and expanded on Aristotle's theory and created their own. We've learned about Howard Gardner, we've learned about Carl Jung. Today we are going to learn about Ivan Pavlov. In the 1920s, a Russian scientist named Ivan Pavlov further developed Aristotle's theory of learning by association. He created his own experiments, studies, methods for learning. He discovered that when he was feeding his dogs, they began to salivate. You know, when your mouth waters, even before they got their food. Later, he noticed that the dogs began to salivate as soon as he came into the room at feeding time. This interested him. He was a Russian scientist, very observant, and simply being around his house, feeding his dogs, he noticed this and was interested in it. This scientist, Ivan, began to ring a bell every day before giving the dogs food. He found that soon they began to salivate, their mouth would water, as soon as they heard the bell. The dogs associated the sound of the bell with food, and so began to salivate before they even saw any food. The dogs could be made to salivate any time Pavlov rang the bell, even if he did not give them food. This was his theory. He built on Aristotle's theory of association and applied it to this experiment. This experiment is known as Pavlov's dogs, and it's where the dogs associated the bell with food. Pavlov showed that associations can be learned to things that are normally not related in nature. Normally, we wouldn't associate food with the ringing of a bell. But he could produce effects over which we have no control. Pavlov's dogs had no control over their ability to salivate, but could still be taught to do so. So associations can be learned to things that are normally not related in nature and produce effects over which we have no control. The dogs had no control over their ability to salivate, but they could be taught to do so. Likewise, it was found that classical conditioning, this is Pavlov's theory that he built upon Aristotle's association, he found that they could also be broken. In similar ways, people make associations between things that happen in their surroundings and can produce responses they normally have no control of. For example, when watching a horror movie, a person may remember a previous movie in which they became frightened by similar music, scenery, characters. They would begin to sweat or shiver, a response that they have no control over. This is where Ivan Pavlov expanded on Aristotle's association and called it classical conditioning. Pavlov continued experimenting with his dogs and found that if he rang the bell he used before feeding the dogs, they would salivate. So we know that part. However, Pavlov also noticed if he did not give the dogs food after ringing the bell, they eventually began to salivate less. The more that he rang the bell with not giving the dogs the food afterwards, the weaker their association of the bell with the food became. His theory of classical conditioning, that you can teach things normally not related in nature to have an association, he also found that it can be broken. If he didn't give the food right away after ringing the bell, the dogs weren't associating the sound of the bell with being fed as much. The more he rang the bell without giving the food, the weaker that association. After continuing to ring the bell but not giving the dogs food after it for a long enough time, The dog stopped salivating upon hearing the bell altogether. He had broken the association between the bell and the food. When he rang the bell and gave food right away, it increased that association. They'd hear the bell, their mouth would begin to water, they were expecting food. When the food didn't come, that association became weaker. That is the theory behind Pavlov's dogs. Today, a similar technique is used to help treat people with severe phobias. A phobia is a very strong fear that can cause a person to become very frightened or panic upon coming in contact with the object of their fear. So, in other words, producing a response that they have no control over. Common phobias include arachnophobia, the fear of spiders. Claustrophobia is the fear of small spaces. In some cases, treatment of arachnophobia may begin with the showing of a picture, simply a picture of a spider, to the patient. This may be followed by showing someone holding a spider in their hand. Gradually, the patient, upon seeing that nothing bad is going to happen, may begin to see the spider less and less as a reason to be afraid, just like Pavlov's dogs began to see the bell as less and less of a reason to expect food. In this way, the patient being treated for arachnophobia breaks the association between the spider and something bad, and they may lose their fear of it. This is known today as exposure therapy. Exposing someone to that object of fear and showing the results to hopefully break the association, to weaken that link. On the other side of classical conditioning, we have operant conditioning. Besides Pavlov's, another theory into learning is called operant conditioning. It is added to our understanding of how people learn. The theory basically states that the reaction we get when we do something affects our likelihood of doing it again. For example, if a child misbehaves and is punished for it, they are less likely to misbehave in the future. They're going to stay away from the behavior that they did to avoid the punishment they received. As well, if you wear a new shirt to work and you receive many compliments, you're more likely to wear this shirt in the future. We do things that will bring us either feeling. If we're doing something that we don't like, we get the punishment, we're going to avoid it. If we get praise for something and we like it, we might do it more. This theory into learning is called operant conditioning. Although what is described seems obvious, it was not scientifically proven that we learn in this way until the 1950s, when an American scientist named B.F. Skinner showed the theory was true by the following experiment. So now we have B.F. Skinner, who is conducting an experiment, and he did multiple experiments. He did his experiment on cats, where a cat was placed in a small box in which the only way to get out was to remove a bolt that locked the door. Outside the box, there was a food reward that the cat could get only if it opened the box. Understandably, at first, the cat took a long time to remove the bolt to open the door. Eventually, however, the cat would know to open the door as soon as the cat got placed in the box. It would know, all right, I'm going back in this box. I need to open this door. When I get out, there's food on the other side. The cat remembered the way it had previously acted in a similar situation. So it repeated what it knew had in the past allowed it to get out and get the food. This experiment showed that the cat associated removing the bolt with satisfaction, that is, food and freedom. Repeated the same action when placed in the situation again. Would the cat continue to remove the bolt if the box was changed so that the bolt no longer controlled the door? Much like Pavlov's theory of getting the dogs to salivate when they heard the bell, and then finding, well, what happens if I don't give food? They wanted to know the opposite reaction. What happens if I don't give food right away? Will the dogs still salivate every time they hear a bell? And Pavlov saw no, their mouth waters less and less as food takes longer to come. So just like Pavlov, Skinner wanted to see what would happen if removing the bolt didn't produce the effects that the cat wanted. Eventually, the cat learned it would stop removing the bolt because it didn't help it to get the food any easier or any faster. So this is different than Pavlov's dogs because the cat in this experiment was made to do something it had control over. It had control over removing the bolt, as opposed to Pavlov's dogs had no control on whether they salivated or not. The cats do. So we have the operant conditioning and we have the classical conditioning. Now I mentioned that B.F. Skinner ran a few experiments. Skinner's theory of learning says that a person is first exposed to a stimulus, which elicits a response, and the response is then reinforced. So we have a stimulus, we have a response, we have reinforcement. This ultimately is what conditions our behaviors. According to his principle, behavior is followed by pleasant consequences. If the consequences to follow are positive or pleasant, the behavior is likely to be repeated. But behavior that is followed by unpleasant consequences is less likely to be repeated. Skinner introduced a new term into the law of effect, which is reinforcement. Behavior that is reinforced tends to be repeated, it's strengthened. Behavior that is not reinforced tends to die out, be extinguished, it's weakened. Skinner studied operant condition by conducting experiments using animals. One of his most popular is the Skinner box. The Skinner box, and I don't know if I put a picture on. No. The Skinner box is, you know what, I'm going to pull it up so that you can see it. It's simply a box in which Skinner was able to observe 3 types of responses. He found that there are neutral operants. He found that neutral operants, there are responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Then he learned that there are reinforcers. Reinforcers are responses from the environment that can increase the probability of a behavior being repeated. Now, a reinforcer can either be positive or negative. Here's the Skinner box. So if you can see, I've pulled up online here the diagram of what it looks like. Thirdly, there are punishers. So we have neutral, we have reinforcers, and we have punishers. Punishers are responses from the environment that decrease the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. So this is punishment will weaken the behavior. We can all think of examples of how reinforcers and punishers have affected our behavior. As a child, you probably tried out a number of behaviors and learned from their consequences. For example, when you're younger, if you tried smoking at school and the chief consequence was when you got in with the crowd you always wanted to hang out with, you would have been positively reinforced. You would have been rewarded, and then the behavior would likely be repeated. However, if the main consequence of you smoking at school was that you got caught, you got suspended, your parents became involved, you would certainly have been punished, then the consequences would be much less likely for you to smoke in the future. So we have the reinforcer of the positive, something good coming out of it, or we have the punisher, something bad coming out of it. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning describes positive reinforcement. In that positive reinforcement, a response or behavior is strengthened by rewards, leading to the repetition of the desired behavior. The reward is a reinforcing stimulus. The secondary reinforcers are stimuli that are reinforced through their association with a primary reinforcer, such as money or school grades. These do not directly satisfy an innate need, but they may be the means. So a secondary reinforcer can be just as powerful a motivator as a primary reinforcer. Think about our class here. By completing the coursework, submitting your assignments, you finish all of them, you earn a credit, you are one step closer to getting your diploma and graduating. That might be a primary reinforcer. You want to graduate. Secondary reinforcer would be our student prize that we have going on. You could win an iPad, you could win a Kelly Kettle, you could win a backpack, you could win. We have had all these prizes in the past, and it might be just as strong, as powerful a motivator as the primary. Skinner showed how positive reinforcement worked by placing a hungry rat in his Skinner box. So that's the diagram that I have up here on the board. The box contained a lever on the side. You can see this lever over here on the left-hand side. And as the rat moved about the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. This immediately caused food pellets to drop into the container. After being put in the box a few times, the rat quickly learned to go straight to the lever. The consequence of receiving food if they pressed the lever ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. Positive reinforcement strengthens a behavior by providing a consequence an individual finds rewarding. You're more likely to repeat it. This method incentivizes the less desirable behavior by associating it with a desirable outcome. Now, negative reinforcement is the termination of an unpleasant state following a response. So this is known as negative reinforcement because it is the removal of an adverse stimulus, which is rewarding to the animal or person. Negative reinforcement strengthens behavior because it stops or removes the unpleasant experience. Skinner showed how negative reinforcement worked by placing a rat in his Skinner box and then subjecting it to an unpleasant electric current, which obviously caused the rat some discomfort. As the rat moved about the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. Immediately, when it did so, the electric current would be switched off. The rats quickly learned to go straight to the lever after being put in the box a few times. The consequence of escaping the electric current ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. Skinner taught the rats to avoid the electric current by turning on a light just before the electric current came on. The rats soon learned to press the lever when the light came on because they knew that that would stop the electric current from being switched on. These all built upon Aristotle's initial theory of association. Lastly, we have Skinner's theory with punishment, where punishment is the opposite of reinforcement, since it is designed to weaken or eliminate a response rather than increase it. It's an adversive event that decreases the behavior that it follows. Much like reinforcement, punishment can work either directly applying an unpleasant stimulus, like a shock, after a response, or by removing a potentially rewarding stimulus, for instance, deducting some pocket money to punish undesirable behavior. We learned from Skinner, I'm going to go back to our slides here. We learned from Skinner the accompaniment to Pavlov's classical conditioning. We got operant conditioning, which all stemmed from Aristotle. We're going to practice recognizing the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So I have a little game here, and we're going to see if we can categorize what the event is. Is it classical conditioning or is it operant conditioning? So the first picture I have here, we need to decide whether it goes into the classical column or the operant column. Blinking eyes when something comes close to you. If you blink your eyes when something comes close to you, is that something that you can control? Is that something that has been learned? Or is it something that you have no control over? Remember, classical conditioning is that association by Pavlov, by teaching, whereas operant conditioning is getting a reaction when we do something that affects our likelihood of doing it again. So when we think of blinking eyes when something comes close, we want to put it in the classical conditioning column. What about walking when a green light comes on? When you see that walking light at an intersection. When you have seen that stimulus, you have been taught that it is safe to go. So that would fall into our operant conditioning. What about a driver who's going along and all of a sudden sees a speed trap? They see a cop pulled off to the side and they immediately check their speedometer. Would that be classical conditioning or would that be operant conditioning? We think of it as operant conditioning because it affects our likelihood of doing something. Maybe we got pulled over before, we got a speeding ticket, so we want to make sure that our speed is good so we don't have that same experience. Shivering when frightened. We talked about watching that scary movie and you remember a previous movie in which you became frightened by similar music, scenery, characters, you begin to sweat, you begin to shiver. Remember, that was classical conditioning. Much like the dogs who have heard the bell, they begin to salivate. Here we have a circus lion who is jumping through a hoop to receive a food treat. If you make it through this hoop, then you get a reward. That came from B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Much like the cat who wanted out of the box or the mouse who pushes the lever, you get that treat reward. That's operant conditioning. A dog reacting to its name being called. Has it learned to respond to its name from repeated exposure? Yes, that is our operant conditioning. What about the smell of fresh bread baking and your mouth immediately begins to water? Much like Pavlov's dogs and the ringing of the bell, the smelling of the baked bread makes your mouth water would be classical conditioning. Here we have a dog just reacting to a loud noise. Is that something that they have been trained through punishment or reward to understand for operant conditioning? Or is it something that you've associated with something else? And if so, which it is classified as classical conditioning. We have 3 left. Removing your hand from a fire. You've put your hand close to something hot and you take it away. That has been associated with maybe a pain in the past or you know the consequences. That is classical conditioning. A pet being fed with canned food comes running when they hear the can opener. Is that operant or is that classical? It goes to our operant conditioning. Much like dressing warmly on a freezing day, you've learned the consequences of being cold, maybe getting hypothermia or frostbite, you dress warmly. So there we have some examples of classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. I started to touch on Skinner's theory of punishments and rewards. We talked about not only the positive reinforcement and the negative reinforcement, but they are learning tools. To help learning, punishment and rewards can be useful tools. The consequences of our actions strengthen or weaken the chance that we will repeat that behavior. So here we have rewards. Rewards are either a good thing that is given or a bad thing that is taken away. Examples include a reward of you did something well, you're going to be rewarded by being given an extra slice of cake. Now, there's also the punishment reward, and that's when the punishment is reduced. So rather than being grounded for a week, your grounding period is shortened to maybe 3 days. You're still being given something, or that bad thing is taken away. Those are examples of rewards. Here we have another example. An addition reward is better clarified into being given something. You are given something good. Maybe you're given that extra slice of cake. A subtraction reward is having that bad thing taken away, like you're grounding, or maybe you don't have to eat your vegetables. I don't know why vegetables get such a bad rap, but they do for a lot of people. So then it can be a subtraction reward to take it away. You don't have to have that bad thing. You don't have to do it. Next, we have punishments. Punishments, either a bad thing is given or you're taking away a good thing. Examples include you're given a grounding, you're given that bad thing, you're given timeout. Or it can be something good taken away. We're taking away the slice of cake. We're taking away your TV time. We're taking away something good. So the addition punishment is when you're given a bad thing. The subtraction punishment is when you're taking something good away. Rewards and punishments. A system of rewards and punishments greatly speeds up the learning process. Person puts more effort into learning if there are consequences, whether good or bad, to their actions. They will put more effort into learning. So remember, rewards are giving something good or taking something bad away. Punishments are giving something bad or taking something good away. And they're further classified into the subtraction punishment or addition punishment, the addition reward, or the subtraction reward. That's how we can remember whether something is given, either good or bad, depending on if it's a punishment or a reward, or something is taken away. I have one more game just to end us off today before we run out of time, and that's practicing categorizing whether something is an addition reward, a subtraction reward, an addition punishment, or a subtraction punishment. So here we have getting a new bike taken away. Getting a new bike taken away would be something bad. So we're looking at punishment. Is it something bad being given to us or something bad being taken away? And a new bike being taken away would be subtraction punishment. They're taking that good thing away. What about getting a new pair of shoes? Getting something would be a reward. So are we getting a good thing or are we getting something bad taken away? We're getting a good thing. We're getting a new pair of shoes, so that would be addition reward. So see the difference between addition reward and subtraction punishment. We are out of time. We will finish playing this game tomorrow, and we will get into how learning affects thoughts in tomorrow's lesson 5.2. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.